So I know when I'm making a documentary, we sort of recreated my own thought process, which is first I go to the archives, I get that original material, and then I want to talk to the people who are there. And today, we have the great fortune to do that. We've got three guests who represent three distinct views at this moment in time. A scientist who is raising concerns about this research, a scientist who is supporting this early research, and a council member who is trying to take it all in and weigh that decision. So I want to welcome up at this time David Clem, Jonathan King, and Harvey Lodish. Come on up.
Where should I sit?
Anywhere you like.
In the middle, okay. I'm the bookend. Okay. Let me shake your hand first.
That was a great presentation.
Well, all right, I don't want to get too much in the way of the recollections. What's going to happen is I'm going to introduce all three of our eyewitnesses, and then we're going to pose one or two questions and let them get to talking and witnessing. But in the introduction, I'm also going to include a little bit of historical flavor of how, if you'd seen them in 1976 around these hearings, you might have encountered them. So first, we have Jonathan King, who you've heard a bit from before. He was a microbiologist at MIT, as well as an active member of Science for the People, raising concern about recombinant DNA. And here he is.
Charged with protecting us from the danger. And these people are willing to get up in public and say there's absolutely no danger, there's nothing to worry about, the facilities are super safe, the bugs won't make you sick. Well, that is the last person that I am willing to trust in terms of my health and my danger.
And then we also have David Clem, who is a city councilor serving on the city council, who had not encountered recombinant DNA in any depth until the events of 1976 forced it upon the city of Cambridge.
Well, I tried to break down the issue into two facets. I discovered very early on that I am not technically capable or able to evaluate the element of scientific risk. So I looked at the other facet, which is the process that was used in establishing guidelines to control for danger.
And finally, we have Harvey Lodish, who is a professor of cellular biology, also at MIT. And we don't get to hear from him just yet because he was up in the galleries watching the events unfold. But he'll have plenty to say as our conversation continues. And so with that, Luis, you want to ask our
Harvey,
first
if you were
question?
holding a sign, let us know. We want to see it.
I was sitting there watching and trying to take in the whole spectacle. I had never seen anything like it. I was appalled by some of the things that my colleagues said.
And that's exactly our first question is, what was it like being in that room? Well, we'll ask you a little, as a second question, what brought you to that room and a little bit more of your background. But for the first question for each of you, we want to have you kind of evoke that moment of what it felt like to be in that City Hall chamber as this debate had just erupted. So maybe if we can start with you, Harvey. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, just a little bit of background. A few years before my laboratory started studying diseases of the blood-forming system, a disease called beta thalassemia. And we needed to use recombinant DNA. We needed the gene for the hemoglobin proteins to really understand it. There was no conceivable way putting a gene for hemoglobin in bacteria that's going to cause chaos, particularly if it's done under BL2 containment facilities. And I went there to watch the debate. It was not a subtle debate trying to understand the different degrees of potential danger. It's one thing to clone a gene for a cancer-causing virus. Quite another thing to clone the gene for hemoglobin. And that point got lost in the debate. It was either everything should go forward or everything is unsafe.
And so what was the atmosphere that you encountered then in the room?
A lot of shouting and not trying to understand the science. Many people said they didn't understand the science. Part of the problem, and I'm guilty of it, many of us were, we didn't try or know how to explain the science to the people in a way that they could understand the subtlety between putting the SV40 gene, which is a cancer-causing gene, and studying a normal human protein.
So maybe that gives an entry then from science to the people to science for the people. So, Jonathan, what was it like for you that evening?
So, in thinking back about these questions, you know, I'm of the generation, I never would have been able to be a scientist if it hadn't been for public funding. My parents couldn't afford to pay for law school. They couldn't afford to pay for medical school. It was because you could get a fellowship from the United States government and get a PhD and then do research, which my father never believed. He never understood that, you know, that there really was public funding. So I was sharply aware that this good life I had, and it was a good life, is doing research at MIT, depended on public funding. And those of us in science, and the people who follow this closely, we knew that this was in the process of being privatized, right? The proponents who talked about freedom of research and solving medical problems were putting in applications for patents. They were rounding up investors. If you read the Wall Street Journal, you could see it happening. So this public technology, which is so important, that's why it was so successful in the United States, because of the public funding, was being privatized under the table. So I was a little angry at that. And so being at a city council, hearing, like, that seemed right in some sense, right? You're trying to get public protection of this, you know, this new technology. Now, the group that I work with in Science of the People, we weren't opposed to technology. We were among the scientists who were developing it, right? Right, my lab was a key lab in figuring out how to get these proteins to actually be active human proteins made in E. coli. But we were concerned this was a manufacturing technology, there was going to be pollution, and it was going to be a different kind of pollution, self-reproducing, right? I knew that nobody had ever cleaned up the chestnut fungus. No one had ever cleaned up Dutch elm disease. So it was a qualitative different risk than chemical pollution, things like that. The last thing is, I mean, it never occurred to me that there were going to be video cameras from BBC TV there, right? I was used to the Cambridge politics. My wife was active in the Cambridge Tenants Organizing Committee. We were used to the give and take of municipal politics. We believed in it. But I remember, whoa, all these lights and you know, and videos is quite striking.
And 50 years later, here we are, looking at it.
That's right. Right. I would say we never succeeded in explaining this was not about stopping research. This was about regulating a new manufacturing technology. And I have been interviewed by dozens of journalists, and no one ever carried that message, you know, into the final story. And we just look around at that map, right? And many of those people at the hearing who talked about the freedom of research, they're millionaires and billionaires, right? I'm not, right? There's no doubt, right, that the privatization of a public technology was going on, and Vellucci's sense to regulate it was sound. You may not like his style. He came from East Cambridge. His cousins were working in the kitchen in MIT, washing the glassware without any representation on any committee whatsoever, no union, no safety committee, no anything. One of the things I'm most proud of is my group pushed for, you got to have a safety committee. You have to have a committee that has people on it who know what happens in a lab, know that people work there late at night when no one's watching, et cetera. So, you know, I would have liked stronger I would have liked guidelines that had studies of risk, epidemiological studies. We couldn't get that, right? But the regulation, as our colleague said, created an environment that allowed for this enormous growth.
So I hear you saying that an important point to bring out is that you weren't in opposition, but you were raising concerns, larger concerns about how the technology might be developed, and that message has sometimes been lost.
Trying to.
Yeah, and certainly Vellucci didn't appear to maybe catch that subtlety. Maybe he saw it as, there's two sides here and I don't know what to make of it. But let's turn to David then, who is on the council and is hearing this as it's going on, who of course has recollections and memories of what working with Vellucci was like. So take us back to that moment and the feeling of what it was like on that evening.
Well, I think the most important thing was that I was 25 years old. I had not had any political experience. I was a newly elected city councilor. I was a student at MIT. I actually chose MIT over Harvard in urban studies and planning because I thought Harvard was pretty arrogant, and I thought MIT was down to earth. I was active in community development corporations on the eastern part of the city. I was the first member of the CCA, Cambridge Civic Association Coalition, who received a majority of their votes from neighborhoods and wards east of Harvard Square. The, generally speaking, working class neighborhoods and student populated neighborhoods. I was flabbergasted when I walked into the chamber. I had been before the city council numerous times on housing-related issues with the community development corporations. I had never seen the chamber filled. I had never seen that much media. I was naive about the background information as to how Vellucci was about to do what only Al Vellucci can do, which is poke the bear in the eye. And the two components that I don't think get enough publicity. Rich McKinnon was Al Vellucci's aide. Rich McKinnon was a native-born Cantabrigian. He went to Harvard. He was my age. He too was newly married, and we developed a friendship. And Richie was an important conduit to be able to communicate with Al behind the scenes, without cameras, without news reporters. The other thing that's not reported, it's acknowledged, but not acknowledged as much as it should be. James Lee O'Sullivan, who was city manager at the time, was the most skilled politician in the room. There had been a massive turnover of city managers in Cambridge, and the split between the so-called independents and progressives, and a lot of turnover. And he brought stability to that office and remained the city manager. And his appointment of the individuals on that experimentation review board was genius. I can almost give you which one was selected as to why they would provide credibility to individual counselors. Because they knew them, they respected them, and that was a brilliant composition. And I think they did a remarkable job. Me, I just went along with the tide. I was trained as a social scientist. My laboratories were neighborhoods and zoning and land use. But I was trained to question authority. Anyone that had lived through an era where your president was a crook and your attorney general had his thumb on the scale were naturally pessimistic about authority. But I did believe that I needed to do more homework, and I spent a considerable amount of time trying to get up to speed on what had happened at Asilomar, what had happened within the scientific community with internal debate.
Yeah, so I guess in that spirit, like, what were some of the frames that you all put over this new issue? I know that in the transcripts, former Councillor Clem, you sort of talk about the nuclear power industry, sort of parsing the questions of self-interest and environmental regulation. Like, how did you make sense of recombinant DNA as a possible hazard? Is it a disease? Is it a chemical? That's used. So all these metaphors sort of pop back and forth in the discussion.
Well, as I said, I wasn't capable then of evaluating the safety risk of recombinant DNA. I certainly didn't understand the science. I am no better equipped to do that today. Mm-hmm. But I thought I made some legitimate points about, let's take a look at our history and what we've done, and from a policy standpoint, how is it that we fund an agency and give it the responsibility to promote the research or to promote nuclear power, and we then give them the ability to regulate themselves. That seemed to me to be a conflict of interest. It remains a conflict of interest as far as I'm concerned today. And so my fundamental objective was this process in Cambridge should be more transparent. We should call people out. We should make sure they identify, not just Al Vellucci's theatrics of leave off the alphabet, we know you're smart, but who they were affiliated with and what they were doing so that lay people could make a judgment. Lay people, Tip O'Neill taught me that 95% of the time, the general public gets it right if they have access to the same information. And so that was the philosophy that was driving me as a rookie city councilor. I was a smart ass from Texas. There is that element, no question about it. I was considered an outsider by many people in City Hall because I had upset a 25-year veteran. And one of my favorite all-time photographs of my tenure on the council was Inauguration Day, when Al Vellucci and I both wore morning coats and top hats. And just as the city photographer was about to snap the photo, I announced, Al, do you realize you were first elected the year I was born? And that's exactly what he did, and I've got the photograph to prove.
This hearing happened the year that I was born. So, I'm curious, there was a story that there's a telegram that was received from Texas saying that there are more forms of life in Harvard Square already than we can stand. Is that true?
Well, after the initial hearings and during the work of the citizens group before the regulations were finally promulgated and the votes took place, I had developed a personal relationship with Al Vellucci. And he was whining and dining me, trying to get me to be the fifth vote to elect him mayor. Remember, he was an independent councilor, and it was the CCA councilors that joined to make him mayor. And he was courting me, and he wanted to take me to East Cambridge to the best pizza place. He said, I know you CCA people don't know anything about it. Well, I had known about that pizza place for the 4 years I'd lived in Cambridge. I'd worked in the neighborhood. I knew all sorts of people in East Cambridge. He was astounded by that. But he then invited me to his place on the Cape. And his wife, Dorina, who I admired a lot and was an extraordinary Italian cook, made pasta for me to die for. And we hit it off. We had a great visit. Kathy and I were both there. And Dorina would bring pasta to the city council chambers every Monday night so that Al could give it to me before a city council meeting. So I reciprocated that favor. We invited Al to come visit my parents and Kathy's parents in Tyler, Texas. It was Al's first airplane ride. My father cooked a barbecue for him, showed him how to do Texas barbecue. Kathy's father was the head of Parks and Recreation. The Tyler Rose Festival was underway, and Bob presented him with a medal to walk in the parade, Alfredo Enrico Vellucci, Lord Mayor of Cambridge. and we had a delightful time. And it was that type of personal rapport, also working with Richie McKinnon, that allowed us to come up with, ultimately, a unanimous vote, which was unusual in this era in Cambridge.
So can you help us understand the politics on the council itself then? It was unusual to get a unanimous vote. Were there something, I think at a later point, 17 amendments that were being offered in various ways? And without going into the details, but how did the councilors relate to each other? Because there's certain moments that people will see in the play and that are in the video where you, for instance, are grilling quite hard on certain points. And I'm curious how that would have played into the discussions among the councilors themselves.
I actually felt then, and in hindsight even more strongly, that every single counselor that I served with had a very deep and strong and commitment to the city of Cambridge. Maybe to their neighborhood more than the city at large, maybe to their ethnicity, but I respected all of them, and I think we all respected each other. I think I was the toughest pill for them to swallow because I was an anomaly from how you get elected in Cambridge politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Harvey, can I ask, what did it look like from the gallery? How are the counselors receiving or engaging with the folks who are testifying?
I don't remember the counselors. I was paying attention to the speakers, trying to understand what they were saying and parsing. Can I comment a bit on what Jonathan said? There was an undercurrent of fear of biology becoming an industry. And that was going on during the 70s. It continued in the 80s with the founding of the Whitehead Institute, Jack Whitehead's motives. And the delay in research delayed the starting of a number of companies, Biogen, which Phil Sharp started, Genzyme, which I helped start, and literally delayed the generation of many life-saving drugs. In other words, the concern was somehow people were going to get rich by patenting things. But what was missing was the fact that there were many diseases we could not cure, and many of us had ideas, however vague, of going after some of them. So there was a consequence to this 2-year postponement, in that it actually delayed the development by companies in Cambridge of a lot of these drugs.
So Phil, you've been called out. I don't know if you have memories you'd like to share, but this would be a wonderful opportunity for you.
I just will say this. We were delayed by this activity, and some scientists left Cambridge. The most noted was Tom Maniotis, who left Harvard, ultimately was at Cold Spring Harbor and into Caltech, where he had a fabulous career, and now he was recruited back to Harvard. The thing that's interesting is, even though there was a delay, Genentech was formed in '76, and it was a very small operation for several years. And in Biogen in '78, once Biogen and other companies came to Cambridge, an explosion happened. It wasn't that Biogen, created biotech or Genzyme. It was in Cambridge we had the hospitals, the finance, and everything that really made this whole industry extraordinarily productive. And we had a culture of collaboration. It's clear, the culture out there is one of interaction. Even major companies talk to each other in this town, which they didn't do before in other parts of the world. And I will say Cambridge has changed. If you look at the taxes biotech and pharmaceutical companies pay in Cambridge, it has significantly transformed Cambridge. So there's been benefits to the citizens of Cambridge. And I can assure John, I came from a background like John, and it was only through public investment that I was able to go to school. But at the end of the day, the only way to take this technology and improve people's lives is to use it. And that's what Biogen was about.
John, do you want to say something about public investment?
By the way, the piece you two guys did was brilliant. That was great. I want to say something, but in the background, there's a tendency to treat the public as, willing to be buffaloed and unable to appreciate the subtleties of the debate, et cetera. Given Harvey's point about, yes, there were these diseases that depended on biotechnology, I want to remind people that it was in that period in the 70s that it became clear how many young Americans had been poisoned by lead poisoning, how many by mercury poisoning, how many shipbuilders had mesothelioma from exposure to asbestos in shipbuilding, how many workers in the aniline dye industry had bladder cancer. In Woburn, the children who had brain cancer, some of you have seen a civil action, right? They had to go to Cincinnati to get an oncologist because no cancer scientist in the greater Boston area would publicly testify that there might have been a carcinogenicity of the pollution coming out of the plant. So it was very sound knowledge about the dangers of these unexpected etiologies of disease from pollution, from stuff coming out of, factory effusion. That was in the air, and people knew about that. David referred to it, for example, with the nuclear power industry. So I did not think that the public was hypersensitive or hysterical. I thought the public is soundly summarizing what has been learned in modern industrial society about where you have to be careful. And if you have to delay a few months and a very small number of people, because genetic diseases are a tiny fraction of the total load, if you think about what we're dealing with now, heart disease and cancer and arthritis and diabetes, right? These are not due to having a defective gene, it's due to being poisoned by some aspect of your life. So the public was, thank goodness, we need them back, right? We need them back. This model should not be viewed as something to be put aside, as, we need to make it more robust. While we're talking about personal relationships, I want to reveal something never before revealed in this debate, that I never would have been before that city council if Harvey Lodish hadn't recruited me to the position at MIT. And he was the one who invited me to give the job seminar, and if anything I said is problematic, blame Harvey.
That's a particular type of Harvard historical determination.
We can agree to disagree. And that's important.
Well, that does lead me to one of the questions, given that we also have Professor Sharp here. So we have 3 members of the MIT biology department who were involved in the hearings. And one of the questions I was the hearings were on June 23rd, 1976. What was coffee like on June 24th?
Let me say that, I had, there's a point in the movie where they show stuff being poured down the drain, right? And I worked with Salmonella typhimurium, a food poisoning bacteria. And now it's true, the strain we work with causes food poisoning in mice, not humans. But if you get a big enough splash, it is mildly pathogenic. And in those days, there was no, we didn't decontaminate it, we just poured it down the drain. And that came out in one of those, in the follow-up testimony before the Public Health Commission, where they had people there. There was a nurse and a public health person who could ask close questions about these things. And it got back to my department, in particular my department head, that I had made this comment about how we handle the salmonella, who was absolutely furious and didn't talk to me, for weeks and weeks afterward, just, went by in the hallway. And I had that experience from many of my colleagues who just stopped talking to me. Luckily, some maintained their civility, but not all.
I wonder, if you can tell us more about what those hallway discussion moments were like, and maybe Phil, if you'd like to join in also. What was the transformation that happened as a result of this hearing in the relationship in the places where you were, in the departments? Did things change?
No, we didn't. We were a molecular biology, cell biology department. We didn't have any epidemiology. We didn't have any public health, right? Many of us knew that the E. coli strains were human wound infected strains, and the notion that they weren't pathogenic, that's how come they had come into the research labs, because hospital microbiologists had isolated them from nasty wound infection. But there weren't any hospital people in the lab in those days, and the connections that people like Harvey and Phil developed with clinical scientists, right, to develop drug tests, that didn't exist at the time. So the isolation between the academic microbiologists and, for example, the hospital microbiologists, I would say was complete, right? Some of our Harvard colleagues could state publicly that there was no danger to these strains, even though the origin of the strains was nasty human wound infections, and there was nobody there to stand up and say, this needs to be taken into account.
Although prior to the debate, as part of the discussion, there were seminars by infectious disease microbiologists that we had at MIT, several, that detailed what it would take to actually make a bacterium infectious, pathogenic by putting in new genes. And those discussions probably led ultimately to the BL1, 2, 3, 4. In other words, there are still some experiments today that require BL4, which is essentially containment where you wear spacesuits and you breathe through tubes to the ceiling. I've been in BL4 labs. So there are dangerous experiments, but the majority of experiments that we wanted to do were deemed extremely unlikely, putting human genes of various sorts in bacteria to cause disease, given the multiplicity of things that a bacteria has to have to become infectious.
And for the average member of the public who's just seen the
It was
Andromeda
lost.
strain,
It was lost.
Huh.
And again, we as scientists were not good explaining these subtleties. Certainly not. It was certainly not done in the council meeting. Just as an observer, there was no one there that tried to say, well, wait a minute. This experiment, yeah, you're right, is something that would be potentially dangerous, like the one Janet Mertz was advocating. That's a known cancer gene. Putting a hemoglobin gene in bacteria, that's different.
But this language of danger and of potential hazard, and what do you think you're going to do if you do make such a thing?
Exactly.
Right? These are the questions that the counselors would then hear and realize that they needed to have an accountability for that.
Exactly. It was a scientific discussion that needed to be toned down so that non-scientists could understand it. And we as scientists are still not good at that.
Councillor Clem, what did it feel like then? Was it toned down?
Well, as the layperson representative here, I think one of the consequences of this experience in Cambridge is that I suspect that there are many professors and assistant professors and others in the academic departments of Harvard and MIT who now pay closer attention to what's going on at Cambridge City Hall. So I think that's a good outcome. I'm not saying that they didn't vote before, but I am reasonably confident that a significant percentage of them may have voted for a president, but they had nothing to do with Cambridge City politics.
The mayor noticed this there's a radio broadcast of the Pantechnicon that happens at the end of July, early August. And I think it's Bernie Davis who's there in discussion. And the mayor says, yeah, I don't think I saw you at the city hearing. And the response is, I don't go to city hall hearings.
Well, the other context that I will provide, when I was elected to the Cambridge City Council, I was an MIT student. I was the first MIT student that was ever elected, and still am the youngest person ever elected. And I was involved in neighborhood activities in Cambridgeport and Riverside and Area 3 and 4 in East Cambridge, and I knew a lot of local people. And most of those people were working class people like my mother and my father. And while they were very proud to live in a town that had MIT and Harvard, not that they had any direct relationship with it necessarily, some were employees, but they were proud of being in the home of MIT and Harvard. So I reached out to the newly appointed president of MIT as a student, as a newly elected city councilor, because I knew MIT was facing some land use and zoning challenges for the Simplex property that they had purchased. And I reached out to him and said, I just want you to know that I was elected from that neighborhood, and my constituents want MIT to do something there that will create jobs and tax revenue. We don't want it to be a replication of Kendall Square, where the government comes in and wipes out 250 businesses, destroys 2,500 jobs, loses title to the land and all that tax revenue. We want something to happen. And the president of MIT responded to me by saying, well, I'm not interested in land use, I'm only interested in curriculum. And that ended the conversation.
Yeah. And
fast forward a little bit, when suddenly the recombinant DNA issue, I get a call from the president's office. Councilor Clem, we would love to have a meeting with you, me and the provost. Are you available? So that factors into those relationship deals. Sometimes I think that was fortuitous. Sometimes I think it was genuine. Sometimes I think it was just a gesture. But that's the language of political life. And I started my political career by waking up after my wife and I had bought a run-down commune on Western Avenue and discovered we were on a truck route. I mean, we had come down to look for an apartment on the weekend. I was still at Dartmouth. We were working in the summertime, and we came down to look for an apartment. And in 1971, the average apartment in Cambridge was $250 a month. You could rent a ranch in Texas for $250 a month, and we were living in an apartment in Hanover, New Hampshire, that was $100 a month, including heat. So I said, this is ridiculous. We can own something cheaper than we can rent. And I figured out that we could buy a house under $20,000. We went to every bank in Central Square. Finally, one bank said, do you have the money for a down payment? And I said, well, my wife's grandfather just died and left her $3,000, so that's why we think we can afford a house up to $17,000. I've read your rules. And he said, well, what's your credit? I said, I don't know. I've never borrowed money before. And he said, well, is your wife working? Where is she working? I said, no, she's not working. She's going to school too. We're both trying to get our PhDs. And he said, well, I can't lend you money. And I said, well, I don't understand why you can't lend me money. You're lending people that I would rent an apartment from for $250 a month. I still don't have a job. My wife still doesn't have a job. And he said, well, that's a valid point, but I have rules. And then he said something that changed my life. He said, I want you to go to Sears Roebuck in Porter Square, and I want you to buy a washer and dryer. They will finance anyone. You make one payment on that washer and dryer, and you will have a credit rating. And so I did that, and I'm here to say we owned a washer and dryer before we owned a place to hook it up to. Now, as it relates to what Professor Sharp said about the attractiveness of Kendall Square, as many of you know, subsequent to my career on the council and in state government, I partnered in a real estate development company, and we became the largest builder of research labs in Kendall Square. And that we were competing against Boston Properties, a huge company that had all of their land designated for free, and it was vacant. And when Seba Corning came to lease a 10,000 square foot lab, Boston Properties turned them down, and the head of Boston Properties said, go see Clem, he'll rent to anybody. So Boston Properties actually referred my first laboratory tenant to me. And we went to every bank in Boston to finance our property, and we were turned down by 21 banks. Every bank in Cambridge, every bank in Boston. Ultimately, Winter Hill Federal Savings and Loan in Somerville, and yes, it's that Winter Hill. That's another story and documentary you should check out. They gave us money to buy the property. They loaned us 18 months of interest at 6 points above prime, this was during the Jimmy Carter years, so we were paying over 20%, and 10 points to close the loan. And he said, you have 18 months to make payment, pay me back, or I own that property. And we did it. We pulled it off. But we only pulled it off because ultimately our equity financing came from Scottish widows who were trying to diversify, and the head of their investment was a supporter of mine from Cambridgeport who ran for school committee in Cambridge and lost, but I supported him, and he supported me in my race for city council, and I won. And he became the chief investment officer of Scottish Widows, and they wanted to diversify their investment, and they looked back and said, you know, funding life science research next to major universities seems like a pretty safe bet, since 70% of the burn rate of a startup company is personnel. Real estate's rarely more than 10 or 15%. Location, location, location meant MIT, MIT, MIT. And that's when, as I've said to others, I went to a ULI conference where McDonald's talked about where they selected locations. And I was blown away by how sophisticated their presentation was. I couldn't believe it was so sophisticated, and I was mesmerized. And then the Burger King representative got up and said, we locate within 100 yards of McDonald's, and sat down. And so that became my real estate development strategy, my Burger King strategy. I developed buildings within 100 yards of MIT.
So Phil, how much of Kendall Square is a Burger King strategy?
A good bit of it, but I want to say, and thank David for introducing it, throughout all of this, MIT Central was involved in this issue. They came and talked to people, to me and other faculty. They had a working relationship with Sullivan, who was city manager at that time. And they encouraged the faculty at MIT to get involved, be involved in the street activities. So I just want to say that there was this communal concern and engagement at MIT centrally. I don't know what was happening at Harvard, but I suspect they were also coordinating with Harvard. And one of the most interesting things today is these stories by David. I had not heard them before, and it is really nice to have you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I think we might want to open up for questions, so get your questions ready here, but go ahead, Harvey. Okay. All right, I see we have some hands. Let's go straight there.
Hi, my name is Sarah Wicker. I'm a current student at Wellesley College, and I'm starting research with Whitehead this summer. So I want to start by saying thank you all for coming to the panel and bringing your unique insights to this event. My question is two parts. So you've discussed the need for balancing political oversight and regulating emergent scientific research, but what, in your opinion, is the role of personal, moral, and ethical considerations when participating in such research? And how do you continue to pursue commensal relationships with colleagues when you have differing opinions?
Probably me. I'll do my best. Full disclosure, I've helped start 14 biotech companies, several quite successful, Genzyme, Millennium, which I did with others. The first point is always a consideration. But remember, we're dealing with sick people. We're dealing with the many people who get a diagnosis of a disease, a rare disease, a genetic disease, or otherwise, where there is no treatment. Genzyme, we're proud, developed the first drugs for rare diseases, inherited genetic diseases, which allow many people to live normal lives. So that's always in the background. Safety when you develop drugs is paramount. The first clinical trials you do are phase 1 are safety. You give it to a few normal people, occasionally people with the disease, and you look for every possible side effect that you could imagine. So this underlies really all of the development, and that's why I, among many others, felt it was important to begin to take the research out of our universities into companies, because it's only companies, not universities, that actually develop the therapies and have the resources to test them, manufacture them, and so forth. That's not what universities do. We do the basic science. So that was always in the background, particularly at MIT, which is an engineering school. And there were many companies formed out of MIT. This is widely known in everything but biology before the advent of biotechnology. And the second question, what was it?
Sure. So how do you continue to pursue relationships with colleagues that have differing opinions?
We do our best. How do we pursue relationships with colleagues? The good news is I'm surrounded by colleagues with very different opinions. And we try to respect each other and talk about it. On the other hand, at a place like MIT, we come with very different backgrounds and very different expertises. And collaborations between multiple research labs on a single problem are very common. This requires the development of some skills in people management, which all of us had to learn on the job. We're not taught this in graduate school. How to do exactly what you're asking, which is bring together individuals with very different skills to work on the same project. And furthermore, if you're building a bio business, you need scientists, you need investors, you need financial people, you need chemical engineers, you need a whole group of people.
Great, thank you.
And that's what we try to create, a culture at MIT where it's part of the soul of MIT for people with diverse backgrounds, let alone personalities, to work together. So,
thank you, Harvey. So
yeah.
Maybe we can have another question from the audience.
Yeah.
There's our microphone. Oh, I see here.
There's one here.
Hello, I'm Veronica. I'm a sophomore at MIT. I was wondering, when you watch, like in the videos and the presentation, a lot of the biology practices seem a little bit different than the ones I was taught when I started taking lab classes. Could you talk a little bit about how we got to the biosafety level, like restrictions that we have today, and how much came out of the specific events of '76?
You want to do it?
Well, there was one image of mouth pipetting. So in the kind of work I did, in the course of experiments, you would do hundreds or thousands of individual mouth pipettings in an experiment. I myself was very proud of my skills of getting very high accuracy. And I remember in my lab, we were totally set back by the notion that mouth pipetting was a no-no. You couldn't do that. You couldn't put the pipette in your mouth if at the other end of some microphone. You had to use some kind of pump or things like that. And that was really, that was really a sea change. But if you believe in regulation, right, and you're not a cynic about it, you go along and everybody slows up a little bit and everybody works a little safer. I do want to take the opportunity and fill in something you said. There are plenty of situations where no way the two groups can work together. So I'm very active with other colleagues in physics at MIT around nuclear disarmament. We've opposed the notion of dropping atom bombs all our professional lives. We have colleagues who still work on developing more powerful bombs. No, there's no working relations between them. There's two sides, and the two sides are in opposition, right? And, in a war, there is an adversary, and plenty of times it's a war. Hopefully, in some of the biomedical areas, you avoid that and you figure out ways of working together. But it enters in it as a real problem.
Maybe we'll do one last question from the audience, then we have a final prompt that we want to get your take on.
Thanks so much. Really fantastic panel. A question, I've heard a lot, kind of differing views on the tension between policy work, regulatory work, and science. I don't know who's the right person, probably everyone, and I don't think we have time. Do you think that should be a valid tension, or do you think that if done well, those two things should not be in tension and should actually support each other to get better in terms of kind of policy improving scientific outcomes, not holding it back necessarily, and scientists kind of appreciating that balance is actually important for public safety and trust?
Let me try paraphrasing something Phil Sharp said. Science has been funded by public money. Federal government, even philanthropic donations, people get tax relief for donating money and so forth. And I think increasingly scientists realize that we have an obligation to take the public into account. When I started in science back in 1971, this was not a topic of discussion, but it came out. Silomar facilitated some of it. The discussions here facilitated it. Now it's quite common. I personally work with several governments trying to help them develop a solid science policy, particularly on genetics.
All right. Unfortunately, we have to get into further discussions, which I think will also address that question. But so thank you very much to our panelists for giving their impressions.
David.